Magento 2 distinguishes between injectable and non-injectable classes. When I first read about that, I was confused because, as it turns out, a non-injectable class technically can be injected as a constructor argument. So it's not a technical limitation. It's actually about how classes are intended to be used. Any object that is injected as a constructor dependency should be fully initialized and should be usable as a shared instance. But there are objects that don't have those characteristics. For example, the Magento customer ORM model is considered a non-injectable class. This class is intended to represent a specific customer. But when a customer object is injected as a constructor dependency, it still is empty. No customer data has been loaded into it. And because of that, it is missing the fully initialized and ready to be used characteristic. Customer data first needs to be loaded into the model before it can be used. That is an initialization step, and so it is considered a non-injectable class. But that's not all. A customer model is also not safe to be shared between objects. For example, let's assume both class A and class B receive a customer model as a constructor argument. And it's a shared object. So now class A loads a customer and then maybe changes some values on it. And then class B also loads the customer into the same object. What happens? Any changes that class A made are overwritten. This means that any object that represents some kind of entity is most likely a non-injectable class. We have to use our judgment, which actually is pretty simple once the concept is understood. A counterexample for an injectable class is the customer resource model. This class is a data mapper that takes the customer ORM model and then persists it to the database tables, or it loads data from the database and sets it on a customer model. The resource model does not need additional initialization. It is ready to be used when an instance is injected as a constructor dependency. Also, its state is not mutated, so it's safe to be shared between objects. Let's examine a little example, as code speaks louder than words. This demo class takes both a non-injectable customer ORM model and an injectable customer resource model as constructor arguments. Let's instantiate this demo class in the REPL to confirm that the customer model will indeed be injected. Copy reference. And indeed, customer and resource model both were injected. So even though the customer is a non-injectable, technically not a problem. Please note, we shouldn't be doing this, right? We shouldn't be injecting non-injectable classes. I'm only doing this here as a bad example, just for educational purposes. So it's up to us developers to understand the concept and to show the discipline and avoid injecting non-injectables. Note that not only entity models are non-injectable. Entity models are only one example. The technical guidelines in the Magento dev docs give some more information. Regarding the topic of this video, items 2.2 and 9.10 are relevant. So 2.2 says, object must be ready to use after instantiation. No additional public initialization methods are allowed. And 9.10 says, the request, session, and cookie objects must not be injected in an object constructor. They must be passed only as method arguments, so they also are non-injectables. Unfortunately, not every item in the technical guidelines explains why it is included. It's a great thought exercise, however, to figure out the reasons for oneself. Also note, these guidelines are written for the Magento core development team, and not all of them are applicable or mandatory to third-party developers. I find them quite interesting and good to know. Now, to summarize before we wrap up this video. Technically, any object can be injected as a constructor argument. But if a class requires additional initialization before it is used, or if it is not safe to be shared between objects, so if it has non-global mutable state, it is considered a non-injectable. How can we get non-injectable objects into our code when we need them then? Well, for non-injectable classes, an object factory should be used as the constructor dependency instead. More on factories in the next video.